I'm back. Everything has been cleaned, all the cleaning fluids and solvents have had a chance to thoroughly dry, and everything is ready for lubrication and reassembly. But first I wanted to talk about the lubricants that I use because each one has a specific application on these locomotives. And my intent here is not to be an advocate for any one particular brand, but to give you an idea of what I use so that you can find a comparable product in your preferred brand. First thing I use is this Label 107. It's a medium weight oil, and what the medium refers to is the viscosity. You'll typically see it as light, medium, or heavy in these hobby lubricants. And what that kind of means is that if I shake the bottle, you can see this one moves around a little bit, but it's not super watery, if that makes sense. You could also compare it to this stuff. I shake it around and it almost doesn't move at all. Make sure you're using a medium or heavyweight oil on these locomotives. The light oil just runs out of the bearings and needs to be relubricated again after a couple of running sessions. This other stuff I use, this is Label 102. They consider it a gear lubricant, and what it really is just a very thick, sticky oil. And those are desirable properties in a couple of very specific locations on these locomotives, which I'll get to later. The next thing I use is just this Label 106. It's their white lithium grease. I'll use that in the gearbox. And the last thing I use is this tube of dry powdered graphite. It happens to be KD brand, but there's nothing specific about the KD brand, and it too has an application on these locomotives. Now let's start putting everything back together, starting with the electrical assembly, which is of course the motor and the unit. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my medium weight oil and put a drop of oil on this rear bearing. Next, I'm going to slide in the armature. Now I'm going to take my gear lubricant and put a drop of it on this dental pick. And I'm just going to wipe it around on the inside of the armature shaft hole. The thick, sticky properties of this stuff works really well here. Any other oil or grease that I've previously used just seems to get flung off and eventually finds its way to the commutator, which is not what you want. Next, I'm going to go ahead and put in the brush plate screws just to kind of hold everything together and line it up. Now, I'm going to pull up on it just a little bit. And I'm going to take my brushes, and I don't know if I mentioned before, but the brushes typically have a little wear mark from the springs and a nice flat side which rides against the commutator. You want to make sure you get the little wear mark for the springs back against the springs again. You're going to want to look down the brush tubes to help align the brushes. Once you get them aligned, it'll just drop right on. Gently install the brush plate screws. Make sure your motor still spins freely. The next thing we're going to want to do is reinstall our field wire. Alright, with that the motor is done. Now you might be wondering about the unit. The unit was previously cleaned, and at this point nothing more is needed. You might think that you should add some lubricant or something to the unit, but that's actually not needed and not desirable. Any lubrication here actually prevents reliable operation of the unit. With the electrical assembly done, we want to focus in on the chassis. And since it's now all cleaned and removed of all old oil and grease, we have the worm removed from the gearbox, it will free roll, which is a good time for doing a roll test. What you want to do is just roll it back and forth through a couple of revolutions of the wheels and feel for any tightness or binding. If you do feel something, the motor is also going to feel it, and that will translate to poor running. If you do feel a bind, places I would start looking at would be any debris in the gear teeth. I would look for misassembled rods. If you took the rods off, they're easy to get upside down or swapped left to right. And another thing to look for on the rods are bent rods. A lot of them are really close to other parts, and it doesn't take much of a bend for them to collide and cause a bind. If your rolling test pass, then it's time to move on to lubrication. And this is where those needle point oilers are going to come in really handy on those oil bottles. Again, I'm using my, at a minimum, medium weight oil. And you're going to want to start with the rear axle. It's actually the hardest one to do, but you'll just put a drop of oil on the bearing. It sticks out just a little bit on this side. The other side is quite a bit more difficult. If you can push the wheel set over a little bit to give you some more room, you may be able to get the needle point oiler down there. If not, this is a good spot for a pin or a wire. Put a drop of oil on that and try to get it down onto the bearing. Another option, if you can't do that, is to put a drop or two of oil as close as you can to the bearing and then set the chassis up so that the oil can migrate down to the bearing over time. It usually takes a couple of hours or maybe overnight, then come back and clean up the excess oil. Next place to oil are the front axles, and Lionel has provided us with an oil access hole above each axle. Since there's no oil or grease in here right now, I would put 2, maybe 3 drops into each hole, and the oil will migrate to the bearings on either side of the chassis. Next place you want to oil are the shafts on these idler gears. Lionel has again provided us with an access hole. If you place the chassis with the non-geared wheels facing up, there's a hole on the opposite side of each of those shafts. Just put a drop of oil in there, and that'll get those idler gear shafts. Next place to oil are the rods. One thing you need to understand about the rods is that really they're just along for the ride. They're not actually transferring any motion. In fact, most of these rods are super loose. If you put any oil in any of those pivot points, it's just going to drain out and cause a mess. And so the only place I actually oil on the rods are the 3 screws that hold on this main rod between each wheel. That's the only place I've ever actually seen any wear. And of course I do it on both sides. The next place to lubricate, although not with oil, are the front and rear trucks. If I hold this front truck frame and wiggle the axle, you can see how much it moves. That's because there's no bearings in here. So any oil or grease you put in here won't be held in place. It'll just migrate out and get all over everything. This happens to be a great place for that powdered graphite. You just tap a little bit there, close to the hole. You can use maybe a toothbrush to help you work it in, or a dental pick or something. Once you get it in, spin the axle a little bit, and that graphite will coat both surfaces and provide some lubrication, and it'll last quite a while. You want to make sure you do the same to the rear axle. Hopefully you can see how much that wheel set moves. I've already applied some graphite to this truck, and you can see how nicely that wheel set rolls now. Now we want to assemble the gearbox. I'm going to start by greasing the main worm gear. The way I like to do that is squeeze a little bit of grease out as I spin the gear. And what that does is it just applies a nice coating of grease onto each tooth, and it'll be ready for the worm. Now we want to assemble the worm shaft. Make sure you put a drop of oil in each bearing. You want to make sure you put your washers back on however they came off. And then slide on your bearings. Now if you mark your bearings, you'll want to make sure you got the markings in the right locations. Bring your chassis back over. And your worm shaft should just drop right in. When you get it in the right position, you'll feel it drop down and the wheels will lock. That's what you want to see. I usually like to add just a little bit more grease to the worm. Now we can install the gearbox cover. Make sure you've got the gasket. Let's move on with installing the motor back into the chassis. What you're going to want to do is find your shaft couplers, and I don't know if I've shown how these go together or not, but they have these little teeth, and the teeth will just sort of alternate and fit together just like that. All you have to do to put the shaft couplers on is just slide them on to the worm shaft and the motor shaft, and then you'll want to sort of pre-align them. Once they mate, you can get the motor mount screws in. If you're working on a 3-rail model, now would be the time to get the center pickup rail wire attached. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and pre-route the headlight wire. We'll have to solder that back on in a second. Now we can go ahead and mount the E-unit. Should be 2 small Phillips head screws in the back. And then right here under the arm is a little flathead screw. Now we're going to want to work on the headlight wire. There's usually a fiber washer that goes on first. And then the little contact point for the headlight. You want to make sure that you get this contact plate as close to the insulation as you can. If there's any excess hanging off like there is here, you just clip it off and push it in, and when we get the headlight in there, will organize that a little bit better. Now is a great time for a track test. I've gone ahead and installed the headlight because that can be a really useful troubleshooting tool. If you're working on a 3-rail model, all you need to do is attach one transformer lead to the center rail and the other lead to an outside rail. If you're working on a 2-rail model like we are, you'll want to find the metal wheels, which are going to be the ones with the gears, and attach a transformer lead to the rail that those wheels ride on. You're going to attach the other transformer lead to this receptacle here on the motor. Alright, I'm going to call that test a success. The unit is cycling reliably, he's running smoothly. It's time to continue.